one of the oddities of recent U.S. history is that, differently from many countries, the major political parties, despite all this talk about politics, haven't differed all that much in foreign policy, at least not since the onset of the post-World War II world order, with the West leading essentially liberal and somewhat activist West, basically, the U.S. leading the Western world order. Um, it cannot be said that the supposedly leftist Democrats were pacific, whereas the right-leaning Republicans were particularly activist at all. Um, in fact, it was the Democratic administration that got America all involved in Vietnam, and it was Nixon famously that pulled out and went to China. Um, this phenomenon is also revealed in the odd case of George Bush, who the second, who in his 2000 campaign argued vociferously against nation building, sounding as isolationist as Trump, or even worse. I think he was referring to Haiti at that time. And yet, of course, got himself all mixed up in the most profound and probably misdirected nation building effort of all time in the Middle East, in the so-called Bush Doctrine. So what we have is not really a partisan divide, in my view, but rather a function of the personality of a US president, or the DNA of that president's administration, which brings us to Trump, of course. Uh, I mean, look, he is the most capricious manifestation conceivable of a president driven by his own personality. And therefore, that becomes an extremely relevant thing, more so than classically ideological partisan divides. Now, opinion is somewhat they're diverse on whether Trump might, in fact, weirdly be mainly bluster. Some might argue that at the end of the day, he's in fact, or at least was in his first administration, somehow predictable, other than certain flashes of weirdness like a Muslim ban or whatever. At the end of the day, didn't destroy neither the World Trade Organization nor even NATO. Um, Maybe it's just more abrasive and direct and brash, but essentially more of the same. On the other hand, some would argue that his profound personal inclination to disrupt might might make him indeed a disruptor, especially in a second term where he might go about it differently and more focused. So I think if we really look at what a Trump presidency might look like, we're going to see some serious shifts. First, from a paradigm that combines values versus interests, the classic effort to balance them, to pure transactionalism with a personal twist stemming from what might fairly be called megalomania. Now that's going to affect Armenia because values is no longer going to be an issue, or at least not in any way that is balanced with interests. Uh, Secondly, away from multilateralism to bilateralism, since Trump hates alliances that he can't control. Thirdly, from practicality to political vengefulness, as Trump can be expected to reverse any policies he sees as his predecessors, in a way that he disastrously, in my view, pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement in the second year of his administration. To the extent, therefore, that Biden was seen, the Democrats under Biden are seen as perhaps impotent, but at least nominally in favor of Armenia against Azerbaijan, that could flip. From an instinct favoring allies to an instinct favoring despots and dictators, from limited interventionism to near isolationism, from process and expertise to instinct, ego, and ambition. Now, most people are going to view this through the prism of two major conflicts we're talking about right now, which insanely doesn't include the unbelievably dramatic events of Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh last September. If the war in Gaza is still going on, pressure on Israel will be greatly eased. Concern for the Palestinians will almost completely evaporate. He can also be expected to take action against the UN and the ICC and other globalist institutions that have bedeviled Israel. On the other hand, he could also turn on a dime if some relative of Netanyahu's says something nasty about Melania. So it just isn't predictable. But what is very predictable is that on the second conflict in Ukraine that people are really paying attention to, we're looking at a major, complete and total paradigm shift, I think. Ukraine will very likely lose its major current source of support. It'll basically have to sue for peace and offer Russia its eastern provinces, or risk losing U.S. support and depending completely on Europe. Now, Trump could end the arms shipments. Congress could try to force him to do so, but that requires a 2/3 vote. Extremely unlikely. Again, he could just, it could get ugly for Vladimir Zelensky. He could try to rely on Europe, but I'm skeptical that that will suffice, which leads us, of course, to Armenia and the South Caucasus and to your actual question. Armenia's case has been at least partly predicated on the assumption that the West and the Americans might appreciate a new westward tilt away from Russia, and especially might compare its scrappy democracy favorably versus the authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan, with its aggressive rhetoric and its naked irredentism. All of that could be assumed to work pretty well on a Biden administration, as it would have worked on most administrations in the past, including Republican administrations. But Trump has no problem with Russia, seems to admire dictators like Ilham Aliyev, and doesn't care a whit about democracy and alliances. So you could be a little cynical and say that for all the good karma, Biden did very little for Armenia, in fact, and did not prevent the ravaging of Nagorno-Karabakh. But I think the truth is that this new reality is something Armenia really is going to have to contend with. And moreover, if it turns out that Trump really is as potentially disruptive as I just described in all the 5 points, that could seriously embolden Armenia's enemies and perhaps even tempt Azerbaijan to attack. And what to do that is a rather open question that I think I'll stop now and we'll discuss later.
Robert, your turn.
Unfortunately, and depressingly, I agree with just about everything you said, Dan. And I notice I go to these
What did you
conferences-
not agree with?
Well,
Anything?
every time I speak lately, I'm an optimist, but every time I speak lately, I leave the audience more and more depressed. So I probably won't break the streak here. When I'm a political scientist and I batted 1 for 3 on Trump, I said, well, he'll never win in 2016. He'll never win the Republican nomination. Nobody who says things like this can win a major party nomination. I was wrong. If he wins, he'll lose the election in a landslide. I was wrong. I did say if he gets elected, he'll be impeached because he cannot exist within the confines of the American presidency, which is constrained in its power. There are a lot of institutions, norms. He broke all the norms, but the laws and institutions, regulations, and policies that constrain the American president, Trump cannot exist within those. And so, I said, if he gets elected, he'll strain our institutions, but we'll survive because, we've got a 200+ year history of institutions and democracy. He did more damage to our institutions than I thought he would do. I would not frame this as center left versus center right. I would frame this as center left versus right-wing populism. Trump is a right-wing populist. And in the mold of Erdogan and Aliyev and Putin and Orban in Hungary, and by the way, the Georgian government, your northern neighbors, or Bidzin Ivanishvili, his instincts are sort of right-wing populism and also Russian oligarch. If Trump comes back, so if Biden comes back, there'll be continuity. There may be willingness to take a few more risks in a second Biden administration in terms of building a legacy than we have been willing to take in a first Biden administration. And that legacy is, I think, largely going to involve around finding a way to defeat Russia and Ukraine, however you want to define that. But I think there's an emerging consensus in the U.S. national security apparatus that Russia must lose in Ukraine, period. Because if it doesn't, we will end up fighting Russia somewhere else more directly. And that consensus is fairly strong in the professional national security bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. And I also think it's correct. If Trump comes back, there will be no professional national security bureaucracy. The people in the first Trump administration, like Jim Mattis and H.R. McMaster and John Kelly, none of those type of people will be in the second administration. If you're not familiar with something called Project 2025, Google it. It's the scariest thing I've seen in U.S. government in my professional lifetime. It's based out of the Heritage Foundation, which has become the Trump think tank in Washington, D.C. And it is an effort to fundamentally remake the U.S. civil service, and it's based on 3 assumptions that I think are inaccurate. One, that the civil service is overwhelmingly liberal, progressive, left-wing. Secondly, that civil servants bring that political ideology into the office with them, and they execute policy based on political ideology. And then the third is that the U.S. federal bureaucracy could somehow function, if all these liberal civil servants would get out of the way, could somehow function like an agile private sector company. So those are all wrong. The U.S. civil service is massive and is largely apolitical. I mean, I was a Army officer for 30 years and in a Department of Defense civil servant for 6, and I can tell you the DoD civil service is not liberal or progressive in any way. It probably is center-right. State may be center-left, the intelligence agencies, so they're all over the map. And in the aggregate, the U.S. civil service doesn't have any sort of political ideology that it adheres to. Secondly, civil servants largely hang their ideology at the door when they come to work, and they just execute policy. That's what they do. And so that's a second misconception of the Trump people. The third is that the federal government can somehow operate efficiently. It's designed to operate inefficiently because Americans have long had a distrust of activist government. There's a great quote from Harry Truman so Harry Truman was term limited, so after a second term, he couldn't run. Eisenhower won the election, and it was in the period between November and January. So Truman was on his way out. Eisenhower was on his way in. There was a historian in the Oval Office interviewing Truman, and Truman said, poor Ike, he's going to sit here and he's going to say, do this and do that, and nothing's going to happen. It's going to be nothing like the Army. He's going to be so frustrated. So this is in 1951, early 52. So this has been, it's not a problem. It's been a feature of the US bureaucracy for decades. Trump wants to remake it, and this would politicize the civil service in a way that would make apolitical, expertise-based advice take a backseat to what you have in a lot of personalist authoritarian regimes. I'm not arguing we would become that, but when the incentive of the civil servant is to tell the boss that he's correct, to tell the boss what he wants to hear. So I think I'm very worried about a second Trump administration. By the way, our allies and partners are as well. I was at a conference in Bucharest and a conference in Odessa recently, and each of them had Trump panels. They had people from Heritage Foundation and these other sort of Trump-friendly organizations talking about what foreign policy would look like in a second Trump administration. It was all very sort of meant to soothe partners and allies, although one panelist said the quiet part out loud, and she said, and I'll end with this, she said, yes, well, if President Trump is reelected, and we think he will be and hope he will be, then Ukraine aid will have to stop because, this is a quote, we are just trying to survive. To which I thought, we being the US, are trying to survive what? What existential threat do we face right now? You'll hear them say the southern border. The southern border is a problem. It's not an existential threat. We have a broken immigration policy, but it does not threaten U.S. national security in any appreciable way. We have partners and allies who are under grave threat. But I think in a second Trump administration, Ukraine aid, in fact, there's a plan already out there that's leaked where we would approach Zelensky and tell him, either you go to the table with the Russians or aid gets turned off tomorrow. So that's what we'll do.
Does the diversification of Armenian foreign policy with friends like India, France, Greece, can also help shape the future US policy toward Armenia? Because we know that during Trump administration, the relationship with India was very close. Could that be influenced in the future relationship with Armenia and having Armenia shifted toward more diversified foreign policy, including Gulf region and Saudis? Can that change the map of the US foreign policy during both upcoming administration, Trump or Biden? Dan?
I think it's understandable why Armenia would want to do that. I think any U.S. administration would have to appreciate that for Armenia to execute a mindless, blind, and total pivot towards the U.S. Is a big ask, considering the rank failure of the West to prevent what happened in the past year and a half. And it's interesting to contemplate why that happened, but I think it should be put on the table what happened here. The International Court of Justice ordered Azerbaijan to end its blockade of the Lachen corridor. The ICJ has no powers of enforcement, but the Security Council does. And yet, the Security Council and the UN did nothing. The US tried to compel nothing, and they let it get away, Azerbaijan get away with an action that was a complete brazen and total violation of an order. And then, of course, that was followed by an attack, which the US clearly opposed, which led to, arguably, to an ethnic cleansing, which the US and the West opposed. And again, nothing. Barely condemnation. There was condemnation, but almost nothing. So I think in this environment, when an administration that undoubtedly values the values side of the values versus interest argument is so impotent, I think there would be an understanding on the part of a future Biden administration, certainly. And as for Trump, again, I appreciate what we heard, that Trump, weirdly being an appreciator of dictators, might somehow do a deal with Aliyev, and that could somehow be helpful. That's true as well. But I think Trump also values loyalty, and there is a scenario where if he suspects, for example, that Armenia's multilateral diversification might include elements he doesn't want, or might include the Europeans. Weirdly, I think he'd be more upset about a pivot to Europe than a pivot back to Russia. Then that could also affect things. And the last thing I want to say is this. You know, I've encountered in my various travels, especially in the Middle East, a lot of skepticism and cynicism about the United States back when all the administrations were the same. The idea being that the US, like the Soviet Union back then and anyone else, basically goes by interests. And as a very young man, I remember arguing with the Romanians in the 1990s that the US is a case apart, where they need interests plus values. I'm not saying they don't need interests, but the combination works well for the US. Now, that is why the US has been so robust, reasonably robust, in helping Ukraine, because there was a values argument plus an interest argument. There is the same thing that applies when I help Israel. There's the same thing that applies if they indeed end up confronting China over Taiwan or whatever. The problem for Armenia is the values argument was there, and there was a bit of a delusion that that will suffice, but the interest side of that equation is a case Armenia, I think, failed to make. And honestly, I'm currently engaged with my own company's work with Armenia and trying to come up with that argument. And you have arguments, but it has yet to blossom into something compelling enough to move the needle on foreign policy.
I mean, I'll keep it short. I guess I would just say, the more foreign capitals in which Armenia enters the discussion in bilateral meetings with US diplomats or politicians in a positive way, not as a problem to be solved or as a Russian client, the better.
Armenia's conflict with Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh placed Armenia in the uncomfortable position of appearing in some way to challenge internationally recognized borders. And that often is unaccepted here, but really the world was reluctant to get too involved when they don't know what to do with self-governing republics within another country. It's just too weird for most people. I find it too weird even for US foreign policy insiders. They don't know what to make of that. So in a way, possibly the truly disastrous and tragic result of that, which I bemoan every day, might have a version of potential for clarification. Because if, for example, Aliyev doesn't stop, and God forbid he attacks again, and this time he attacks sovereign Armenian territory in the outrageous effort to carve a corridor to Turkey, and you all know what I'm talking about, that will be treated differently, even by an administration that is totally transactional and doesn't give a damn about anything, because the idea of violating international borders and that were established by the post-World War II order that I mentioned before, that has some potency. And I would go so far as to say that even a Trump administration might care about the violation.
Yeah, again, if I could add, I agree 100%, Dan. Previously, Armenia, so Nagorno-Karabakh was always been with Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria as post-Soviet frozen conflicts. That's no longer the case. And in that discussion in US policy circles, it was Well, in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, it was the Russians who sort of intervened to solve the conflict one way. And in the Nagorno-Karabakh, it was seen as the Armenians who intervened to solve the conflict, to resolve it in their favor. And so now that that conflict has been ended with an Azeri victory, this tension between the norm of territorial, the legal precept of territorial integrity and self-determination, which are always in tension in all these conflicts, is no longer operative. It's purely a case of territorial integrity. And I agree that even a Trump administration would sit up and take notice if there were grave violations of the international border.
I want to come back to recognizing the state of Palestine. I would like your input, Dan, and also Robert, about this issue. And do you think this will ease our relationship with Arab nations, or it will make it hard for us to reach to United States? How do you analyze this approach of Armenia on recognizing the state of Palestine?
Look, I can assure you that it enraged the Israelis, but on the other hand, given that Israel armed Azerbaijan in the way that they did, I don't think the Israelis have can expect to have too much moral suasion on Armenia. That said, though, it's a tendentious thing. There currently is no state of Palestine on recognized borders. Many Palestinians themselves, if you did a referendum in the West Bank and Gaza, I think you might find more of them favor a one-state solution, where they become citizens of Israel and end up outnumbering the Jews and renaming the country Palestine, and they have all of it. So for Armenia to get itself involved in this, making really upsetting Israel, which who knows, may arm Azerbaijan more for more skullduggeries, but not only that, upsetting the US Republicans as they have, I have to ask myself what they got in return. And if we allude to some greater degree of symbiotic relationship with Arab countries, and maybe so. I've seen it speculated that Saudi Arabia might have been a factor, a little weird because they're currently flirting with Israel themselves. I've seen it speculated that Turkey might be a factor, maybe involving the efforts to reopen the border, conceivable, I guess. It seems to be a genuine mystery, and I don't rule out that it might have been a capricious mistake. But who knows? There may be more here than meets the eye. So I think I have to somewhat reserve judgment.
And we'll talk about it more on day 3 during the Arab world and Saudi Arabia sessions.
Biden needs to get reelected, so he's got to be very careful. But I think in a second Biden administration, you could see U.S. policy change more to be more balanced between Israel and Palestine, and you could see support for Israel draw down, and that would make this Armenian recognition of the Palestinian state less of a problem. If Trump comes back, it's going to be, because the first time Trump's going to hear of Armenia is when someone tells him this, and that's going to be a big problem.
Well, on that happy note, I'd like to thank you all. This was very informative and enlightening. We're very happy you were part of the discussion.